Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Tim Rambles On About Wine. Today, we want to talk about oxygen management. In this particular case, we're going to talk about our white wines. So your wines for this are going to be four of them. So get out four glasses, open up your bottles of Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, and then your little sample vials of the N and the O, and those are both Sagemoor Riesling. If you can hold off on those if you want for a little while, and if you wanted to just use two glasses, that'd be fine. And just start with Sauvignon Blanc Chardonnay, and then take a little break, pause the video, and come back in with Riesling, because it's going to be a totally different idea when we talk about flotation. Talk about oxygen management in white wine. It's your friend during pressing for non-aromatic white wines. You can use oxygen to reduce some phenolic compounds. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. How much does that really work? And then during fermentation, using oxygen is a really, really good thing to help your fermentations along. One thing I always want to point out is if you are doing some barrel fermented Chardonnay where you're all 3/4 full on the barrels while you're fermenting, make sure to do that final rack when you've got a little bit of sugar activity left, because then the yeast will suck up any oxygen you're having during racking. You don't have to worry about inert gas or anything like that. Where it's a problem, it's a foe at any stage for aromatic whites. It can really whack aromatics on the head. And it's always a problem post-fermentation. After you're done with primary, it's really, really important, even if you're undergoing malo, to keep oxygen to a bare minimum. White wines oxidize and they fall apart really, really quick. So even if you're doing malo, make sure you've got those barrels topped all the way up, really close to the bung during malo, because there's not enough CO2 being produced to protect that wine from being oxidized. And then again, any time after that, filtering and bottling. We're going to do a whole unit just on bottling alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reductive processing. You guys are all familiar with this. You've all seen this. And this is the idea of just minimizing oxygen at every turn. So how do you do it? The best thing to do is to use a closed membrane press like we have, preferably one with oxygen exchange of some kind. They do make them where you can have an inert bag on the other side that is basically a big balloon that blows nitrogen in and out. We just do it by dumping in bunches of carbon dioxide while it's happening. And then sometimes you want to do it all the way at the crusher while you're crushing. And if you do happen to machine harvest, a lot of people will add ascorbic acid and SO2 in the vineyard to go ahead and keep those things from happening, the oxidation from happening on the transport to the winery, because once you're machine harvesting, those berries are getting broken. So really frequently we'll see people add ascorbic, because that's also a great antioxidant and is a great reducing agent. These are the things we use primarily: carbon dioxide at the crusher, press and tank, and then a little bit of SO2 all the way along the way. Generally, we add about 50 parts on the front end during processing, and then during pressing, we'll have another 50 part add that we'll add incrementally between the press cycles. We're going to do 5 press cycles, add about 10 parts between each press cycle, and that'll keep that juice fluorescent green and keep that polyphenol oxidase completely inhibited, and that juice won't brown. So our idea here is to end up with nice fluorescent green juice. We're going to be doing that by adding SO2 at the crusher, maybe even ascorbic. And then got some good gas right at the top, so that the second we're getting those berries burst, they're immediately protected from oxygen to keep that enzyme polyphenol oxidase from taking hold. And here's a nice little GIF of what you should see when you do this absolutely properly. You've got this beautiful fluorescent green juice pouring out of the press from the beginning to the end of the press cycle. You never get any of that browning. So let's talk about advantages and disadvantages and some problem solving in this particular arena. So the upside is it retains aromatics in certain varieties, ones that have oxidizable aromas, and pretty much the only ones this comes down to are things with lots of thiols. So Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Gris are probably the whipping boys for this. Riesling has some oxidizable aromatics to a smaller degree, but things like Chardonnay and maybe even Muscat to a degree have very few oxidizable aromas. Most of the terpenes that are in Gewürztraminer and things like that are pretty stable compounds. So they're not going to oxidize particularly easily. So consider your variety. And then the other times it keeps the juice, really clear and green. So if you're looking for a really vibrant colored wine, that can be helpful in that sort of just almost fluorescent clear look. And take a look at that 2019 Sauvignon Blanc in the bottle, and you can just see how absolutely crystalline it is. And the other side to this too is that you're using CO2 and you're adding a bunch of SO2, so you're minimizing a lot of aerobic bacteria and yeast that might be coming in. So native, flora coming in from the vineyard. The downside is because there's no oxygen in the juice, it's a more difficult environment to ferment. And a lot of these wines we're taking to really highly clarified states in order to get rid of any leesy, mouthfeely characteristics. We're just kind of going for laser focused aromas. So highly clarified juice can do that. It's harder to ferment anyway. And then you go ahead and compound the fact that there's no oxygen in the juice for the yeast to get started on. So you're going to need more nitrogen in these wines at the beginning, middle, and end to avoid reduction. The other side is because you're crushing the grapes more aggressively, you're adding more SO2. These things all lead to increased tannins and phenolics. And so you can end up with a really grippy wine. So there's some real advantages to using flotation, when using reductive style processing. And I'm going to talk about that when we get into flotation here in a little bit. And then the other side of this too is you're using a bunch of SO2 and CO2. That's a really big deal. If you're trying to be minimal interventionist, you're trying to, use minimal amount of product, minimal handling, you're using more chemical. And so whether it's ascorbic acid, SO2, CO2, you're adding additional, costs and interventions into the wine's life. And lastly, the thing is that when you do reductive style bottling, you have a very limited shelf life on these wines. These wines get really tinny and tin canned, canned corn when they're 3, 4, 5 years old. So this is not for an ageable style of wine. This is for quick to market, quick to consume, where we're trying to retain as much of those fresh, fruity, thiol-based passion fruit guava aromas in a Sauvignon Blanc. But if you have a bottle of our Sauvignon Blanc 3 or 4 years down the road, it's not going to be nearly as enjoyable. So go ahead and taste this. Here's our 2019 Sauv Blanc. This is a perfect example of reductive processing. We clarified this to a point where we actually used turbidity, which we've talked about, where we were clarifying and doing the flotation until we got the wine perfectly clear to a level that we wanted. Sometimes when we do heavy pectinase enzyme settling, we can get as low as like 4 or 5 NTU, which is really, really brilliantly clear juice. And because of that, it's too clear and it's really hard to ferment. So sometimes you can over clarify juice. So we tried to clarify this one just to a point where we had just the right amount of solids so it would give it a more positive environment for fermentation. QA23 yeast, which is our stock standard, house yeast, and stainless steel fermentation took about 27 days, and we fermented it low, slow, and cool. And here's the final chemistry on it. And what you're looking at is a pretty much dialed in, spot on wine. The reason we're not particularly worried about our molecular sulfur dioxide being 0.8 is this is sterile filtered. We don't need an antimicrobial at this point in time. So really popped it. We definitely had to work on this at the end. Sauvignon Blanc group will note that we had to come in and do a little deacidification because we had too much acid. Then we came back with just a touch of residual sugar. I think we're sitting on about 3 grams a liter, so 0.3%, and really engineered this wine. So this is what I would call a highly engineered, highly designed, really this is the best Sauvignon Blanc we have ever pumped out of college cellars. I think it's just gorgeously aromatic. The mouthfeel is really slick. And I think it was putting all of the years of understanding of reductive processing, then now how to use flotation, and then, all the pieces of the puzzle to be able to get this wine in bottle. So combination of reductive processing and flotation is what has really brought this together. And then, of course, coming in at the end with just that touch of sugar and, taking the acid down a little bit to bring the wine into balance. But yeah, definitely not a low intervention wine. All right, let's flip the script. Oxidative processing. This is old school. This is how we've done it forever, whether it be in a basket press or just our Wilms press. It is as straightforward as it gets. You throw the grapes in the press and you press them. So the theory is it's old school. just simply press the grapes without using any major additives. And the idea is we want to oxidize any problems up front. We want to get rid of any potential things that might lead to reduction later on. We're trying to get rid of any really fruit-driven aromas that might come from the fruit. And again, in terms of Chardonnay, there really aren't any. So you're not really losing anything. And the other idea here is that you're going to get some flavonoids in the process of this, things that have a flavor, tannins that have a flavor. You're going to minimize that because you've got minimal handling of the grapes. The stems are involved, which seems counterintuitive, but the stems really lead to a nice juice channeling. So we get really clean, easy press. And so that means the wines have to be pressed less hard. They dejuice easier. And you're going to end up with not only less tannin because of the easier pressing, but then the oxidation part will also help to reduce some of those phenolic components in the wine. And here's a picture of from going back all the way to 1998, where they measured flavonoids and basically how many milligrams liter of oxygen delivered over a period of time, and how much they reduced. So from quite a bit to not quite a bit. So we've had a reduction in some of those more aggressive catechins and even tannins in the wine. So here's some hyperoxidation in action. So this was where we took some Chardonnay juice, and then what we did is we started oxygenating it and causing it to brown. So this was the juice out of the press right after we pressed it. This was after we added oxygen for a little while. It starts to brown a little bit more. And then this was finally when it started to look a little closer to tea or weak coffee. And this is those tannins literally showing up. They're aggregating, turning brown, and then eventually they get big enough and fall out of solution. And the idea with hyperoxidation is you're going to oxidize all these phenolics, and then they're going to aggregate and leave the wine, and you may actually end up with a clearer wine in the long run. And so the Chardonnay you've got in front of you was hyperoxed. So this is an example of what that looks like in action. So just the idea here is we put an oxygen stone in the juice and just started bubbling oxygen, straight oxygen, until it turned brown. And it was really terrifying to do the first time I did it, but I think the results kind of speak for themselves. Yeah, and then boom, coffee. Okay. So the advantages to this, it's easy. You can potentially minimize phenolics, limited additives. You're not even adding SO2 up front. You don't even add it till the tank. So you let the wine get to the tank. You don't have to hyperoxyjuice. That's just another step. That's just one thing you can do. You don't have to do that. And then you can also make a wine more ageable. So because you're going to take anything that might oxidize in the bottle, you're going to oxidize it up front in the juice stage. It's going to fall out. And then any of these other things like glutathione and other things that can come back to bite you in terms of reduction in the end, because they're really powerfully antioxidant, those things are going to get out of there. So if you want a wine that you're going to build to age, you want to go ahead and look at using oxidative processing. Chablis would be a great example of this. They aren't doing a whole lot of super reductive style of processing on those types of wines. The downside is you're going to lose some potential aromatic compounds. That's the trade-off. You're going to lose those short-term, really pretty thiols that would come around and make a wine beautiful, like the Sauvignon Blanc is right this minute. So we won't get that really pure fruit expression. All right, so go ahead and try wine 2. This is your Chardonnay. So this is limited clarification. I mean, we just pressed it to tank. We added no pectinase, nothing. We put it in a tank, and we hyperoxed it till it turned brown. We let it sit kind of chilled overnight, and then racked it to 500 liter Sanso puncheons for fermentation. And this was really low yan coming in, so we had a lot of challenges getting through it, but we definitely added quite a bit of nitrogen to it to get it through. So we added right to the legal limit, 1 gram per liter adapt to get it walked through. The yeast was CY 3079, which is just like the Chardonnay that we have currently. And it's full mallow, and this was barrel fermented, and we let it get fairly warm during the fermentation because we're trying to build mouthfeel at this point in time. So the way we're building mouthfeel is through a lot of things. So when you smell this wine, you're not going to taste that initial beautiful fruit. You aren't going to get that big punch of passion fruit and guava, but instead you get all these secondary aromas. So you've got a little bit of butter and from the ml. You've got a little bit of vanilla and bacon from the oak. And then you've got toast and dough from the yeast stirring. So you're just building a lot more complexity into the wine. And so this wine is also engineered, but it's engineered using things a little bit more from just simply nature, where we're just taking what's already there from the fruit, and then we're going to go ahead and ferment that, and we're going to have a result thanks to the barrel additive. So this is a really good example of secondary characteristics. There are really no primary aromas left. There are no ferment esters left, 3 years down the road in bottle. What you're looking at is now a wine that's maturing. But realize that if you were to taste the 2017 Sauvignon Blanc right now, you'd probably be like, ew, canned corn, gross. This wine's just coming into its own. So the idea here is when you hyperox something, you're going to be able to build a wine to haul. So if you want to do something that's going to last a long time in bottle, you got to get those compounds out of the way. So if you're trying to make ageable whites, a little bit of oxidation in the juice stage is fantastic. Remember, juice stage only. Once we get to fermentation, oxygen off. This is only in the juice stage. All right, so let's wrap up oxidative versus reductive processing. From a chemistry standpoint, I think this is really awesome. So here you have two wines in front of you that are, for all intents and purposes, identical. 100%, I mean, with the exception of volatile acidity, 100% identical. We have, very similar sulfur dioxide numbers. We have very similar pHs. We have very similar alcohols. And I think this is why I tended towards using these two wines, is you can just see how using your varietal and deciding what it's going to be and what processing technique you're going to use, how you can really drive wines into totally different styles. Now, obviously, we couldn't turn the Sauvignon Blanc into Chardonnay. We couldn't turn Chardonnay into Sauvignon Blanc. But if you wanted to make a more Sancerre style ageable white, you could hyperox a Sauv Blanc. You could just go for the pyrazines. You could ferment it in some older oak. And then you could let that wine bottle age for a couple of years and just get that sort of peppery, leesy characteristic that you can get in an aged Sancerre. So that's a stylistic choice that you can make. So consider that when you're making your wine. Where do you want your wine to be? Are you looking for a flash in the pan, doing canned wines, doing fresh, vibrant things that people are going to take off the shelf and drink tonight? Then reductive processing might be exactly what you need to get that real pop of floral and fresh aromas from something like a Sauvignon Blanc. But on a Chardonnay, if you're trying to make a serious wine that critics are going to get into, they're going to try and a few years down the road and get a little bit more serious about the wine, using some oxygen on the front end can help to make these things happen. But also realize, one last thing I want to talk on problem solving, you probably wouldn't want to hyperox or use a whole lot of oxidative processing if you have highly moldy or rotten fruit, because then you're just going to add fuel to an already extreme fire. So when you're working with compromised fruit, really, really think in terms of how you might solve those problems, through use of sulfur dioxide and other things. So sometimes in a bad year, some of your dreams and goals go out the window. But I want to talk about how we might solve some of those problems through using flotation in moldy and musty fruit. But pretty cool. I think this is a really great example. Okay, let's talk about oxygen usage during flotation. You guys have heard me talk about flotation. The idea here is you've got a pump, you've got compressed gas, you've got a diffusion stone, some sort of an expansion chamber, and you're basically pumping a plume of nitrogen into a container, and it's taking all the stuff and floating it to the top. The mechanics you need are a pump, some sort of compressed gas, a diffusion stone, and an expansion chamber. And in this case, you can see really easily how we did that. And then you note on the front of the pump, there's a little sample valve, and that's where we were pulling to check our turbidities as we moved along. So finding in the juice phase, there's a lot of ways you can do this, but this is a really, really, really good way to fix up wines that have problems, or not problems, but I am absolutely sold on flotation. So basically what we do is we take pressed juice, we generally add some pectinase to the wine, and that pectinase thins the juice down a little bit, just like we want. And then the key ingredient here is usually gelatin. Now, gelatin comes in not only you know, bone-based animal proteins, but there are also vegetable gelatins out there. And what you guys are tasting today with the Rieslings and the Sauvignon Blanc, we're done with some combination of regular and veggie gelatins. So they're not perfectly vegan, but you can go that way if you want to. I'm sure there's none left in the wine now because it's been sterile filtered and that's gone. But there's some other things you can add is PVPP, carbon, bentonite. So what you can do is look at your wine, and we talk about problem solving. You bring in some really moldy, nasty fruit. This is the best thing of all because you press it, you treat it immediately with whatever you need to treat it with, and all of these fining agents, such as carbon, bentonite, gelatin, they can grab on to things like lacase, which will destroy your wine, which is just an enzyme. You can grab it and you can pull it out. You can float immediately out any nasty, natural yeast, anything that might take your wine on a bad run, a Lactobacillus conchii that'll rip it through mallow in a heartbeat before you even start fermenting. A lot of really nasty bugs can be remediated quickly. So you get this into tank, you float it, and then you immediately can start fermenting pretty quick. So some additions here, fining agents, gelatin I think is key, but I've heard people floating with just PVPP or carbon or bentonite. There's a variety of different things out there. Consult different manufacturers. I'm learning in this, so don't take me as an authority, but this is what it looks like, and this is the raft that you create on top, kind of like making a consommé. You break the juice and get it to all the junk to float to the top. So here's some visuals. This is the Rieslings that you have in front of you. And this was as we did the flotation process. So the pressed juice is on the left. And then after 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes, and then 90 minutes, this is how much junk we got out of the wine. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then if you look at the slide on the right, this is the nitrogen versus oxygen and that idea of hyperoxing a juice. And you can see how that juice really browned. Now, I want you to take a look in your glass that you've poured these two wines and look at them in the glass and tell me if the color's all that different. And I think it's really fascinating that they look really, really similar and that all those tannins that showed up precipitated and aggregated. We'll talk about what those numbers actually are here in a minute. So here's the advantages and disadvantages, and this is what it comes down to. The upside of flotation, it's done at room temp, no heating or cooling required. When you look at the energy costs of chilling a tank down, it is tremendous. Refrigeration is very, very expensive. We're in Washington State where energy is pretty cheap, but in other states where it's expensive, it could literally cost you hundreds and hundreds of dollars to chill down one tank of wine, one small tank. In a big winery, it's many thousands of dollars. So the idea of being able to get rid of that power requirement is pretty substantial. Again, that upside is you can fix problems. You can remediate mold, rot, and other phenolic grip issues, i.e. the Sauv Blanc, which is usually really grippy and we have to throw a ton of sugar at to cover up all the tannin. We floated all that out this year. It's really cool. And then the other thing is it saves time. You're looking at about 2 hours to float a tank. And in some cases, big wineries have continuous floats where they basically pump the juice in one side and it goes through basically a big trough. And as the juice flows through, it clarifies and comes out clean the other side. And then there's the raft goes to the top and there's a vacuum cleaner that sucks the raft off continuously, and they can continuously flow juice through and continuously float the juice and immediately go from press right through the float machine to a tank and to ferment. And why that's important is that saves a whole tank rotation. So in big wineries, your money is in turning tanks. And if you can cut out having to fill a tank, chill it, settle it for 24, 48 hours, and then rack it and clean it, the energy and labor savings are tremendous. So not only are you saving in the continuous floats, not only are you saving energy, you're saving a whole tank cleaning. And when you think about the labor that goes into that and the water inputs and the cost, it is just massive. And then also, if you do this properly, you'll end up with greater juice yields than you will with just settling. The downside is it's 8 o'clock at night and you just finished pressing and you still have 3 hours to float because you got 2 hours to float it. You got to rack it to whatever you're going to rack it to, inoculate it, and then you got to clean a tank. So moderate product to use. So you're going to be using some more stuff. Obviously do a cost benefit analysis, whether that balances out the energy savings, but some of these vegetable gelatins are getting fairly affordable. So not a terrible idea. And also look outside of the enological product world. There's a lot of vegetable gelatins just available in general. So I know some bigger wineries that just experiment with some of the broader market stuff where they can buy 50-pound bags of it for a lot less money than buying a specific enological one. And then if using a gelatin's an issue for you, there are vegans gelatins available. So I'm going to point that out. So the reality is, what do these look like when we actually do them? So this is our 2020 Sagemoor Riesling trial, which is in front of you right now. And we have in glass one, we've got our control, which is where we just added the enzyme, a little bit of PVPP, a little bit of gel-col super, a little gelatin, and we just let it settle. We just didn't float it. We just let it settle because we had to make everything equal. And then we did the nitrogen flotation, which is where we did a little bit of enzyme. Again, same thing. The only thing was different is it did about 90 minutes until we floated, till we got a certain amount of turbidity. But this one we did with nitrogen. And then the last class is where we did with oxygen. So instead of using nitrogen, we just replaced that gas with oxygen. So this is a really interesting way to see how you can bat around the flavor of a wine simply by using a gas. So pretty fascinating. So let's go ahead and see how that pans out. So looking at your wine chemistry in glass, you've got a big difference. And the control has a lot lower alcohol. It's not for any of the reasons outlined in this study. And one of the reasons I want to point that out is all intentions may lead to weird places. So let the control be a lesson to you in what happens when you don't use a lot of sulfur dioxide. But that lower alcohol content is going to be caused by something we're going to talk about in a second. So if you want to compare really likes to likes, notice the similarities between the nitrogen and oxygen flotation. But man, that control definitely has lower alcohol. We're going to talk about why that is here in a second. Now let's take a look at that acid. And you'll notice that the titratable acidity in the control is much lower because there's no malic acid. It went through a spontaneous mallow. And for whatever reason that happened, it kind of makes this whole experiment defunct in terms of qualitative analyses, because sometimes when you're fermenting things, that just happens. But the differences in titratable acidity between the nitrogen and oxygen are pretty similar, but the control obviously went through mallow. So this is a really good example of like, hey, maybe we didn't learn anything from the flotation test here, but we certainly are going to have a really good idea of what a full mallow Riesling tastes like. So this is a really great opportunity for you to taste through these three wines and go, hey, this is what a full mallow Riesling tastes like. So there's going to be some other things we look at, but we'll focus in most of those things on the nitrogen and oxygen flotations, because they're a lot more similar. Because when you take a wine through full mallow, it's going to really detract from the way the wine tastes. And notice that pH. Look how high that is. Have you ever heard of a Riesling with a pH of 374? Maybe there's a reason we don't take Riesling through full mallow. That's probably not the best plan. So let's focus on the pH between the nitrogen and oxygen. And the oxygen's a little bit higher. I don't have a good reason for that other than perhaps an accident. I don't know. But the reality is it's got a little bit higher pH. But the titratable acidity is pretty similar. I'm going to guess that there was a little bit of spontaneous mallow in the nitrogen as well. But that control is definitely full out. So if you want to taste the difference between a 339 Riesling and a 374 Riesling, this is a good opportunity to look at some of those more basic things before we get to the more heady concepts. Let's talk about phenolics now. Phenolics are a whole different animal. And this is where we really see these stylistic approaches, change a whole lot. So quercetin is made by grapes in response to sun. And so in this particular case, you notice that as soon as we add that oxygen, it starts oxidizing things. And quercetin is one of those things that can obviously be oxidized, because the difference between the control and the nitrogen isn't that different, but that oxygen is a whole lot different. The nasylbin and gallic acid, those are just kind of components of wood. But again, that oxygen really reducing the amount of those phenolics. And that's primarily through oxidation, aggregation, and precipitation of those compounds. Just oxygen burning those compounds up, turning them brown, and then they all stick together, and then they fall out of the wine.
Well, they don't fall out of the wine, they rise out of the wine. So anyway, so let's look at some other things, and this is where things get really, really interesting. And I'm just going to look at, a couple of things here, but let's go ahead and look at tannin, and notice how much lower the tannin gets in that oxygen float. Again, we not only have lost all of our catechin, not that there was a lot to begin with, it's a white wine, I wouldn't expect that, but our tannin compounds drop as well. So again, we're creating tannin, we're aggregating it into big enough compounds that it falls out. So we're changing the mouthfeel of wine. Now, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. The control has the most tannin of all, but since it's gone through mallow, I'm going to guess it feels kind of fat. Just again, don't take any of this as like scientific perfect evidence. Just a really good way of tasting different things that happen in wine depending on how you treat it. And then lastly, this one's kind of fun because caffeic and caftaric acid are indicators of oxidative stress in wine. And you can notice that that oxygen really knocked out the caffeic and caftaric acid. Again, lower, all they are, they don't really taste. They're just indicators of oxidative stress. So this is just a good little, hey, yeah, you oxidized it. But what's really interesting about this is that grape reaction product on the right. And why this is kind of interesting and fascinating and entertaining and all that good stuff is that grape reaction product is created in response to oxidation. So usually as you have caffeic acid and caftaric acid going down, grape reaction product goes up. But I think what this chart shows is we oxidize the juice so much in this wine that not only did we make grape reaction product, it stuck to tannin and fell out. So it was able to remove that as well. So again, the idea here is that by adding oxygen, hyperoxidation of must, you can remove tannin compounds. Now, does that have an effect on other oxygen, other aromatic compounds, other things in the wine? Of course it does. So it's not just like a simple net. But here is a great example for you to take into your careers and go, hey, we did that in college. This might be something I might want to try to apply to some wines because maybe we have a wine that isn't, going to be a real aromatic wine like Chardonnay. And we're going to want to get rid of all the tannins and all the things that might oxidize later on down the road and early on in the juice stage. And then we can make this really nice wine that we're going to do in oak with a bunch of lees where we're building up flavor characters outside of those primary fruit aromas. And then you can have a wine that's not going to have things that can oxidize or fall apart later. So hyperox can be a really useful tool in wines that you're going to kind of age because once you've oxidized it, those things probably aren't going to become a problem later on. But on the other hand, if you want to do wines that are more towards that reductive side, they're going to kind of go towards that tin canny kind of aromatic profile if you don't oxidize those things because there's stuff still there to fall apart. So it's just a good way to choose how you want to play with wine. So conclusions, flotation is really useful in reducing the phenolic material up front. We can use all these fining agents, we can use oxygen, we can do a lot of things to move white wine around in the juice phase. So is it useful? Yeah, it does have an effect on aroma and flavor. It does. You can taste it in front of you. Is it good or bad? I don't know. It's going to depend on your site. If you kind of find something that's a little bit too tannic that you want to work on because of your press or whatever else, this is a good tool to have in your toolbox. It's just a great tool to use to make great wine.